Oh, there's the recording. So John, over to you. You should be able to share your screen.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Now I have to hide all your pretty faces. Okay. Okay. Wow. Does that look okay?
We still
It,
see the slide
Yeah, yeah,
notes and such. Yeah,
oh,
there
there.
you
yeah,
go.
yeah,
That looks
yeah,
perfect.
yeah. One step ahead of you. Sorry. A little bit of a lag here. All right. So, Tracy and Paige and Lorraine, thanks for having me. I last year my phone was ringing off the hook because of slugs. In Pennsylvania, it's been a pretty, I'd say, normal year, so we haven't had that much of a problem. I just learned in the pre-call conversation that many in Ontario are having slug challenges. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I certainly have, I may have some, and I'm happy to have a conversation. So my goal is to be done in 45 minutes, and then that would leave about 45 minutes for question and conversation, because I know the experience of growers has more relevance than some of my research experience. So let me just let's say that and get it out of the way. And I'm happy to defer to Tracy here whenever I don't know something about Ontario, which is probably pretty often, I guess. Okay, so my take-home messages are based on what we experienced in Pennsylvania in 2024. They were the worst slug populations I've ever seen, and that is largely attributable to a mild winter and planting date, which I'll get into. And then we've learned over the years that slug control requires integrating several practices. There's no silver bullet. Our research has shown that predators can help protect crops from slugs, but if you want to rely on predators, then you need to be wary of your insecticide use, so integrated pest management is needed. We've learned that unnecessary insecticide use can make slug populations worse. We've also learned that cover crops can help improve slug control. So those are the main take-home messages that I'll try to hit on today. But just to highlight 2024, so we had growers in Pennsylvania here that had to replant 3 times, so 4 plantings total to get an adequate stand. And that, of course, had costs in terms of the expense of doing that, the time it took to do that, and then the ultimate yield because of the shorter growing season. We had oodles and oodles of slugs. This picture probably shows 20 in this little caption, and the slugs were there waiting for when soybeans came out of the ground. Soybeans were hit worse than corn. And a lot of folks had to plant wet. So because they planted wet, their furrow laid open, and then the slugs could just roll down that trench from one plant to the next. So that was problematic. And the high slug population resulted from a really mild winter in Pennsylvania. I trust the same was in Ontario, although I don't know that. We had for December, January, February, and March of 2023 to 2024, we barely had average temperatures that were below freezing. So in December of 2024, our average temperature in Pennsylvania was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. And for January, February, and March, the average temperatures were in the 30s to the 40s. Of course, that's be typical for March. So slugs never got that cold winter that we need to kind of knock back the adult populations. So warmer winters leads to more slugs surviving the winter, and then they can lay more eggs in the spring. And I'll go over the life cycle just to be clear. So 2024 saw more juvenile slugs because there were 2 hatches of eggs, and those juveniles were active longer and doing more damage. And one complication in Pennsylvania and perhaps in Ontario is that in the last decade, there's been a switch to planting soybeans earlier and earlier. A decade ago, everyone prioritized corn and then they moved to soybeans. Within the last decade, research out of the Midwest suggested that soybeans benefit from a longer growing season, so it's best to get them in the ground early. And that's led to a lot of growers prioritizing soybeans in terms of what to do first in the spring. Um, that research in the Midwest was mostly done in a tillage setting. So it did not include slugs. So if you're planting early because various agronomists are recommending it, but slugs aren't taken into account, I think that the outcome is kind of less clear. The expected outcome is less clear. Um, what we had in Pennsylvania and probably Ontario is that we had April to June of 2024 where the conditions were wet and cool. Soybeans didn't grow well. Slugs were happy and munched away. Um, so that is a frustration I think that a lot of folks had is that they took um, recommendations from agronomists to improve their productivity. But in that particular yield, because the slug populations were so large, they really got hammered for it. Perhaps similar things happened in Ontario in 2025. I don't know. That can be part of our conversation. But for a little context, Ontario and Pennsylvania are similar. Tracey and Jocelyn Smith have had me up to give a couple talks um, in Ontario, southwestern Ontario a few times. So I've seen the landscape and it looks awfully similar down here. You guys are a little bit flatter. So we have rolling hills, but the key is that we have a lot of no-till. We don't have a huge amount of no-till acreage compared to other parts of the country, but about 1.5 million acres in Pennsylvania are no-till, mostly corn, soybeans, wheat, and that is continuous no-till. And of course, there's great value in no-till for decreasing labor, conserving fuel, and protecting kind of soil and water resources. But it promotes slugs because that stable habitat and that thick residue is perfect for kind of slug life. I share this talk, this picture at every talk I give about slugs because it's so impressive. This is a hay mower from southern Pennsylvania from 2012. Um, this guy was mowing his hayfield at night because he ran out of daylight, and the slugs were up on his forage, and they all ended up on the front of his uh, hay mower. So those are all gray garden slugs, which is a wonderful picture. And subsequent to this, I've received pictures of all from all kinds of folks of different um, pictures of abundances of slugs. So here's a planter. This is actually from central Illinois. Um, so these guys were planting green, had lots of slugs on their cover crop, and there you go. But all these things are slugs, of course. They're not insects, they're mollusks, so it's a whole different phylum. So insects and mollusks are pretty distantly related by millions and millions of years. They're distantly related, so very separate type of animals. So if you want to kill a mollusk, you should use a molluscicide. Insecticides often don't have any activity on mollusks because they're a whole different beast. Okay, just as a background piece of information. Slugs can eat whatever they want. There's more and more folks in Pennsylvania growing canola and other brassicas, and that stuff is like candy to slugs. In our experience, that's what they would eat first if you give them a choice. They also love soybeans. They're kind of protein hungry. So they'll eat alfalfa and small grains happily, and they'll feed on corn, but they don't really like corn. They actually have to overeat on corn to get the same nutrients they would get on a different crop. So they're kind of struggling to eat corn, like much like if you were to eat all corn chips all the time, you would have to eat a lot of corn chips to get the right amount of calories and protein. Slug damage is probably familiar to most of our audience members, but this is what it looks like in a cornfield, just kind of scattered bare spots, real thin stands. The low spots are where the slugs are gathering because that's where there's more moisture, tend to be more residue, and the stand just gets thinned. In soybeans, it can look a little worse. This is from a few years ago, but after a third planting, this gentleman just never got an adequate stand because the slugs were doing so well. In this stand, he tried to spread bait, and the bare spots are where he missed. He didn't do the best job of spreading baits. But in the mid-Atlantic states here in the United States, about 20% of our no-till acreage suffers from yield loss from slugs each year. That's a University of Delaware estimate, and most crops and some cover crops are included there. And there's just limited cost-effective management options. So if you had a armyworm outbreak, you could go to your chemical rep and buy all kinds of insecticides, probably 20 different trade names of insecticides. But if you have a slug problem, we have 2 or 3 options. Okay, so you just don't have the same off-the-shelf options. And I've encountered some folks in Pennsylvania that are returning to tillage to control slugs, and that's a bad thing because of the value of tillage for holding our soil in place and not letting it get to the neighboring stream and heading down to the Chesapeake Bay. So the gray garden slug is the most problematic species, and they are kind of prodigious reproducers. Each individual can lay about 500 eggs a year. So their populations can go um, high really quickly. They can increase very rapidly. And this might be uncomfortable for some, but this is a picture of two slugs mating. Slugs are hermaphrodites. So that means that um, every, both sexes are in one organism. And for slugs, all individuals can be fertilized. So in this picture, you can see two slugs mating, and there's going to be stuff flowing both directions. So after this event, both slugs will be fertilized. So it's not like insects where there's a tendency for half the individuals to be female. That's not the case with slugs. So every individual can lay eggs. Okay. Sorry to get graphic on you, but those things that you see there are what you think they are. And they can also survive without your crops. So they can feed on weeds, they can persist on organic matter, they can graze fungi off of residue. So they don't need green material, but that's what they really want. They want green foliage to eat, but they can kind of persist with these other food sources, waiting for the green material to show up. Okay. Here's the life cycle of the gray garden slug. They tend to overwinter as eggs. So in a really cold winter, most of the individuals will be overwintering as eggs. Those eggs will hatch sometime late April, early May, maybe late May up your way. And those juveniles feed for a while until it gets hot and dry. Then they burrow into the soil. They try to hide from the heat and the dryness. And they return in, say, August and September when the temperatures moderate and the rains come. And then those reproductively mature adults will then feed in the fall, mate and lay eggs and do their thing. So the crop damage windows are kind of in the spring during establishment of corn and soybeans, and the fall during establishment of, say, small grains and alfalfa. Okay. The juvenile slugs are the most damaging. So having a lot of adults is not the best, but it's far better than having a lot of juveniles because the juveniles are ravenous. They need to eat to grow, and that's when they're doing their most damage. Um, a cold winter can knock back slug populations, but a cold winter with snowpack is better for slugs because that snowpack will act as an insulator, and that will protect slugs. So if you have a lot of snow and a real cold winter, you can still have good slug populations in the spring. And by that, I mean bad slug populations. So it's this, there's a couple different scenarios in which you can imagine slugs getting through the winter, the adults getting through the winter and start laying eggs again in the spring. When you consider corn and the damage that slugs can do to it, there's a weird picture that emerges. There's a poor relationship between the amount of damage that plants receive and the eventual corn yield. So this figure shows just a small data set that we have. The vertical axis is the wet weight of a corn plant. So this is just a corn plant cut off at the base and then thrown on a scale. And we related that to the amount of slug damage that that plant received early in the season. So we rate slug damage on a 0 to 4 scale. So the highest number on this figure is a 3.5. A 3.5 plant has been defoliated over 75%. So that plant looks terrible. It's kind of looks like it's barely hanging on. The left end here is a 0, so that's an undamaged plant. So these points kind of make a straight line. So if you're going to put a line through that cloud of points, it's going to be pretty flat. And that indicates that a plant that's nearly dead and a plant that's untouched by slugs can have the same growth over the season, so, almost the same productivity. So that's challenging because we as kind of managers see a cornfield that's suffering and we want to do something about it. But the lesson from these data are that if a corn plant is suffering, it may be fine to leave it alone. So my rule of thumb is if you have new growth and that new growth is undamaged, then you just kind of walk away. And that's the majority of the plants. Then there's nothing to do because it's likely that those corn plants are going to grow out of it. We've even seen, and there's another data set, we've even seen when we have small amounts of slug damage that you have a positive relationship. So here on the vertical axis is yield. Horizontal axis is the percent of plants with slug damage. So this is just presence absence. And this is just a percentage going across various plots. And these plants were assessed at V2 and V5. Again, this is corn. So this is a remarkable figure in my mind because it shows that a little bit of slug feeding actually benefits. So if you have 100% of your plants getting a little bit of damage, that's not so bad. You actually might see a yield increase. Okay. So this is another snapshot that provides some indication that slug feeding isn't so bad when it comes to corn. Um, but this is kind of low level feeding. If you throw all our data together, you get a figure that looks like this, which is a little bit more understandable. And so this is an kind of inverted U-shaped figure. A horizontal axis is the percent of plants with slug damage, and the vertical axis is ear weight. So we just cut off the ear and weighed that as a proxy for yield. And what you can see is just this relationship that depends on the amount of damage. So low amounts of damage actually looks like slug have a positive influence on ear weight. A middle amount of damage, it's kind of no effect. And then a lot of damage, then it starts to trend downward, which makes sense. More feeding, it's kind of more problematic for plant productivity. So these data suggest that it's the amount of slug damage that matters. So if it's a little bit of slug damage, like most plants have a little bit, not a big deal. But if most plants have a lot, then it is a big deal. Okay. So the relationship in corn is kind of variable. And again, I'll say that as long as the plants are alive and putting out new growth that's relatively damage-free, those plants should be fine. Now, soybeans are a different matter, and we haven't done the same level of exploration with soybeans. So I'll just leave that for part of the conversation if you have questions there. I have a feel for that, but not the best data from research. Okay, and then if we go into slug management options, it's a very short list. So we have tillage. I'll talk about row cleaners and starter fertilizer. I'll talk about soil temperature, a little bit about baits. I'll mention nitrogen solutions, and then I'll finish with predators. But tillage is not an option for many because most folks that have slug problems are committed to no-till because they see value in it. But that usually leaves people to wonder, what about a little bit of disturbance? We've had an effort for the last couple of years in our kind of agronomy team to understand the value of vertical tillage. So this is in soybeans. And we have some evidence that vertical tillage can mildly decrease slug damage, and those data are here. So for 2 years, a colleague in plant science, he's a weed scientist named John Wallace, has done this work where he's doing on-farm tests of different vertical tillage tools down in Lancaster County, which is southeastern Pennsylvania, a little bit more agriculturally intensive, a little bit more like Ontario, southwestern Ontario than where I am in central Pennsylvania. And they tested these 3 different units. And they had 16 strip plots for each unit across 40 different farms. And they found that vertical tillage reduced slug damage by about 24%. And that's not nothing, but they could find no relationship to yield. So even though that vertical tillage knocked back slug populations, there was no kind of protection or increase in yield from that reduction in slug damage. So from this, we conclude that, yeah, vertical tillage might make you feel good. It might knock back the slug population a little bit, but you're not going to pay for that piece of equipment with any increase in yields or anything like that, or any protection of yield. So I am kind of lukewarm on vertical tillage. I mean, there's something to be said for knocking back the slug population by about a quarter, but if it's not coming out in yield, the value is difficult to justify. And we've also done some work on disking and seen similar things where we can knock back the slug population, but again, it doesn't come out in yield. So you guys are welcome to ask me questions about that. But my feel is that it's not the best approach. Okay, it's not a real. Maybe it's not part of the solution. So I'll just mention row cleaners and starter fertilizer because they can be part of the solution. That's more relevant for corn. But I've heard of some folks doing it for soybeans if you can plant your soybeans. And both these are kind of related to the issue of soil temperature. So that kind of goes back to the issue I mentioned earlier about planting soybeans early or planting corn real early, is that allows you to get a jump on the season, gives you a longer growing season, but it also leaves plants vulnerable if it turns cold and wet, or if it's been a mild winter and slug populations are real heavy, then they can kind of feed longer on those more vulnerable plants. So you'll see in a moment that the row cleaners and starter fertilizer have an effect. It's the same effect that would be if you were planted kind of your corn or your soybeans at optimal temperatures and what I would say on time. If you're planting on time, the soil temperature is right, that seed's going to germinate faster, the plant will get up and growing, and they can kind of outrun slug damage. That's the same effect that row cleaners and starter fertilizer have. So these three things kind of have kind of all together. So these data are a little bit dated. They were just recently published by a gentleman named Galen Dively, who's a retired entomologist at the University of Maryland. He's just got file cabinets worth of data, and he's kind of slowly going through what he never got around to during his career now that he's retired. Kind of a weird way to spend your retirement, but I got to respect it to some degree. So row cleaners are helpful. So vertical axis here is the percent of plants with slug damage. The red bar are plants with no row cleaner, and the white bar is where there was a row cleaner. So we have less damage where the row cleaners are being used, and that's because that row has been cleaned and there's exposure the soil is exposed to the sun. Those plants heat up a little bit faster and can grow faster. So it's an effect of quicker growth, not because the row cleaners are moving slugs away that far or anything like that. And you see a similar effect with some starter fertilizers. So this is three different types of starter fertilizer. The two right-hand bars are ammonium nitrate, either put down at 9 pounds per acre or 22 pounds per acre. And those got the plants growing faster, and faster growing plants receive less damage. Okay. So a similar effect, two different practices. My feeling is if you can do both, then you get a kind of a compounding effect. So that's better. Folks often ask about potash and what that does for slugs. In our experience, it doesn't do, in Galen's experience, it doesn't do a whole lot. I have heard of growers in the western part of Pennsylvania using hydrated lime, and they think it does something. I look forward to chatting with those folks, but I don't know anything more than what I've already said. But some folks believe that that can be part of the solution. So row cleaners and pop-up fertilizer are helpful. That, of course, is most relevant for corn. But if you can make that relevant for soybeans, you could get some benefit from it. Okay, so all those three things together, soil temperature, row cleaners, and starter fertilizer are doing more or less the same thing. Soil warms faster, or the plants just get out of the ground faster, and that helps reduce slug damage. And I'll mention baits. I know what's relevant in Pennsylvania. I don't remember what's relevant in Ontario. Here we have medaldehyde and some iron-based products. I encourage folks not to use these across whole fields because they're pretty expensive. And down here, they're $22 to say $25 an acre. They can be difficult to spread. I've heard of growers trying to figure out how they can run them through their insecticide boxes if they have insecticide boxes anymore. A lot of folks will just put it on a spinner spreader, like on the back of a four-wheeler, or a shaker spreader on the back of a tractor, and put them out. And work from Ohio State has shown that if you can get 4 to 6 pellets per square foot, about 10 pounds to the acre, and that has the best kind of rate of value and efficacy. So balancing value and efficacy in terms of the cost of the product. Some folks will put this out with their potash. So I've heard growers that kind of routinely do this and like it, and other growers that hate it and won't do it because they think it's a waste of money. These products are water soluble. The manufacturers usually say that they're rain fast. In our experience, that's not really true. I know one study out of Virginia Tech that showed that a half an inch of rain can take away about 80% of the medaldehyde-based products. So they're not perfect either. So if you don't have them and you wish you did, they're not a great solution. If you do use them, you can probably verify they're not perfect. Then I'll just mention quickly that there's a homemade solution that some growers are using down here, and this is a nitrogen solution that's being used as contact poison. My nutrient management colleagues don't like when I talk about this because you'd be using nitrogen not as a nutrient, but as a poison. And I'm not sure how that fits into a nutrient management plan, but growers are doing it, particularly when they're desperate. And this can be governed by the rule of 3, which means you're spraying something like 30% nitrogen mixed 1-to-1 in water at 3 a.m. 3 nights in a row. Some of those details are kind of fudgeable, like maybe you just do it one night. You don't have to do it at 3 a.m. It just has to be dark. But the rule of 3 needs 3s in every category, so that's where it comes from. And Galen Dively assessed this in his work a couple years ago now. And the vertical axis here is number of slugs on 20 plants and 4 different treatments. So untreated would be 20 gallons of water. 5 gallons is 5 gallons of 30% nitrogen or 28% urea actually in 15 gallons of water. 10 gallons is 10 gallons of 28% urea in 10 gallons of water. And 20 gallons is 20 gallons of urea spread at 20 gallons to the acre. Okay, and you get about 3/4 reduction of your slug populations by doing kind of the middle one. So 10 gallons of that 28% nitrogen in 10 gallons of water put out 20 gallons to the acre. So that's where the best return is. Okay. So key here is that if you do this and the plants are up and growing, you're going to burn your plants, right? So you're going to see obvious fertilizer stains on your plants. And some folks think that the benefit you gain from this, from knocking back slug populations, outweighs the cost that you might have of dinging up your plants a little bit. But be aware that if you do this, your plants might not look so good for a couple days or a couple weeks. Okay, so let me move on to predators where we have the most information. So an ugly kind of close-up view of a soybean field can look like this. And some growers think that's beautiful. Some growers think that's complicated. As an entomologist, I see that as habitat. So no-till makes conservation possible because in one way, because it provides great habitat for predators. Those predators can thrive in an environment like this because there are more things around, and those more things are food for those predators. Right? And if you can add cover crops on top of that, you kind of extend the season where these animals can be active and increase the food source for these types of animals. And you can be successful in establishing a localized food web. That localized food web will help protect the plants that you're growing because things are eating things above that, in the upper portion of that food web, and that takes pressure off the plants. If you do this, if you do this and have success, this is what the pattern should look like. The vertical axis is kind of proportion of plants with pest feeding damage. The horizontal axis here is the predator population. So as those predators go up, the amount of feeding damage to your crops comes down. So you need a booming predator population to see this benefit. But folks can achieve it as long as they're farming with these predators in mind. Okay. And the kind of the key members of this predator community are ground beetles, but there are also rove beetles. If you have a lot of fireflies, those larvae are predaceous on slugs, and they'll do part of the job too. Some spiders, particularly some bigger wolf spiders, will take down slugs. Soldier beetle larvae will eat slugs. So there's a variety of things that are part of this predator community, but the ground beetles are the big ones. So ground beetles are predaceous both in the larval form, which is in the upper left, and as the adults. And they eat the main things that can arise in no-till production. So black cutworm, true armyworm, wireworm, and slugs. So the more of these guys you have, the fewer insecticide applications you need. But if you want these guys around, recognize they're insects, and then the insecticides you might be using are going to negatively influence these populations. So you have to find a balancing point here. So I try to encourage folks to think about integrated pest management, or IPM, which can protect predator populations by moderating the amount of insecticides you use and force you to use insecticides only when it makes kind of economic sense. But to take this approach, folks need to kind of commit to scouting, checking for pest populations, putting insecticides out only when it makes economic sense. And sometimes the economic sense is just a feel issue. And so for below ground pests, it's even more challenging. So if you're worried about wireworms, things like that, it's difficult to scout for those. So you just need to consider a few more variables and think about the risk that those things pose and kind of historic damage that you might have experienced in the past. But the general policy is if you find pest populations that are exceeding economic threshold, then you use an insecticides. But using them preventatively is often going to work against the predator populations in your fields. Insecticides are an easy solution to some problems, but they tend to be overused. In the United States, and I don't know about Canada, but I would imagine it's very similar. In the United States, insecticide use has increased every year for decades. So since like the mid 50s, insecticides, or earlier perhaps, I think it's earlier, insecticide use has gone up every single year. And that's because more and more folks are kind of reliant on this type of solution, even though it may not be necessary. Because most insecticide use is insurance-based. It's not need-based. It's folks putting out an insecticide because that's going to allow them to sleep a little bit better at night, not because they've scouted and founded an economic justification for putting out the insecticide. Unnecessary insecticide use decreases good insects, and that is primarily those predators that I've mentioned already, but it's also decomposers in fields. And when you have fewer predators, then those fields are more vulnerable to pests. But of course, people aren't buying insecticides just because they want to. People convince you to do this, right? So chemical companies use advertisements, whether it's in print or on the radio or on the web, and they convince you that things are better for your productivity, right? So there's an old advertisement for DDT. You have a singing potato, you have a singing dog, trying to convince you that DDT is good for you. And you see a nice wholesome picture there of a young lady feeding her baby. Why wouldn't you use insecticide if you can somehow connect protecting your children, right? Modern examples of this persist. Big companies advertise their products. In some ways, they're trying to scare you into using insecticides. So here's a advertisement from a large company, and this is the seed treatment that little monsters fear. So this is Poncho. Clothianidin is the active ingredient. It's very common in the United States. I understand there are some restrictions on that in Ontario now. But the marketing folks behind this ad have done their job, right? It's kind of scary looking, but they've used Photoshop to add a second mouth to this animal. So this is an aphid. Its mouth part is here in this proboscis, but these guys have Photoshopped on a mouth with craggly teeth because that's more likely to scare a farmer to think that these things are really something to fear. So there is a little bit deception, maybe not 100% truth behind some of these advertisements. And their job is to get you to be convinced that you need an insecticide. So that's happening, and just be aware that it's happening. But soil function suffers from overuse of insecticide. These data are from a colleague at Cornell University named Kyle Wickings. These data were collected in a turf system, so a grass-based system, but not corn. And this shows a spider plot. That spider plot shows these different axes of things that we want to maximize in fields, whether it's a field of turf or a field of corn, field of soybeans. And all these things are good things. So entomopathogens are things that will kill, are fungi that will kill insects. Phosphatase reflects enzyme activities that's good for fields. Endophytes are things that will colonize your plants. And if you have endophytes, that'll help be protected. So all these things are good things. So including predator density and decomposer density and all those things. And you can see in the different colors the effect of insecticide. So this green polygon, it describes the largest space. And that green polygon represents where no insecticides have been used. And then blue, yellow, then red are increasing amount of insecticides applied to fields. And that polygon area shrinks as you get to the red, which is the highest level of insecticide being applied to fields. So that suggests that the insecticides are having this negative influence not only on the predator community, but also on decomposers, on fungi that might be beneficial to your crop production, the enzymes that might be beneficial, and that's a problem, right? So soil function is highest with fewer insecticides. But we know that insecticide use is intensifying. These data are for the United States. It's just for one active ingredient. This is bifenthrin, a common pyrethroid. It just shows the dramatic increase from about 2008 onward in a whole range of crops. So it's not just on corn and soybeans, but corn and soybeans are the biggest portion of these charts. And I can show you other active ingredients that look just like this. The neonics look even crazier. Other pyrethroids look about the same. So it's just like an over-reliance on insecticides, much of which is insurance-based usage. Right, and here's the maps of the United States. I don't have equivalent data for Ontario, but if you're in Ontario, you can imagine, just look at Michigan and Pennsylvania and New York, it's probably the same thing happening. So this is the estimated use from U.S. Geological Survey of bifenthrin in 1999. And there it is in 2017. So look at the color of Michigan, 2009, sorry, 1999, 2017. Pennsylvania also turns red. And this is in pounds per square mile. So that is a lot of insecticide being put out. All right. So that's just a visualization to understand that things are getting worse in terms of insecticide use. And it's just a mindset. Like folks are putting out insecticides because they can, they're inexpensive, potentially it'd be part of the solution. But when you combine insecticides with slugs, it becomes part of the problem. So these data are from a cornfield in central Pennsylvania. The vertical axis here is the number of slugs per trap. To trap slugs, we just put down small pieces of white shingles. The blue line is where we have uncoated seeds. Okay, so the difference between the red and the blue it has to do with predators. So where you have more predators, you have fewer slugs. So where we have a seed without insecticide, we have more predators, we have fewer slugs compared to where we have insecticide coated on the seed. We have fewer predators and more slugs. So without the predators, the slugs are free to feed, they're free to do more damage. And you guys have restrictions on the neonics these days. I know that. I don't have a whole lot of information on the diamide insecticides that are being used now, but it's probably the case that they're having a similar influence. I mean, they're a systemic insecticide that might be doing the same thing. So we can just talk about seed treatments generally. They can protect yield. Both the diamides and the neonics have systemic activity. The neonics in particular are very toxic to insects, most insects. But the diamides a little bit less so. They're also less water soluble, but the diamides do a good job killing the things they're targeting. So it's probably a safe assumption that they're doing something to ground beetle populations, though I'm not aware of any data that reflect that. Um, I've offered to do some of that work for some of these companies and they've turned me down. But insecticides, their goal is to kill insects. And if we have predators that are insects, it's likely you're limiting those populations if you use any of these insecticides. For neonics, these are the populations that can be controlled. Um, uh, Note that these are mostly secondary pests. These secondary pests mean that they're not the primary concern. The ones that are in parentheses are where the insecticides do particularly poorly. I understand maybe the diamides are a little bit stronger against things like black cutworm. They're not very strong against rootworm, to my knowledge. The ones that are underlined are where the insecticide does well. So in corn, that's seed corn maggot, wireworm, bean leaf beetle, seed corn maggot, and wireworm in soybeans. But recognize that slugs aren't on this list, right? Because slugs are mollusks, they're not insects, they're not being accommodated by the things that are being coated on seeds. And for those neonics, there's been this adoption rate in the United States that's been kind of crazy. So since 2004, the adoption rate has gone through the roof. So this is the amount of neonics on the vertical axis over time. The data stop in 2014 because that's when the EPA and the USDA and the US Geological Survey stopped collecting those data. But there's no reason to think that folks aren't using these things in the US anymore. The adoption rate is vertical. Crazy. In my hands, yield is about the same. And I'm going to zip through this stuff because you guys have probably heard it before. But this is in central Pennsylvania, a treated seed and an untreated seed in both corn and soybeans. I see a yield is exactly the same. But you guys are living in the hotbed of this research. So in southwestern Ontario, Jocelyn Smith at the University of Guelph and your colleague online here, Tracey Baute, have done fantastic research. And it's research I bring to the attention of farmers in Pennsylvania all the time that show the difference between a fungicide seed treatment and a fungicide and a neonic seed treatment. So that's what we have here. FST is fungicide seed treatment. NST is fungicide plus that neonic. And these are the data from their research that shows the corn stand, the amount of below ground injury, the amount of above ground injury and yield when you add a neonic to a fungicide seed treatment, right? And you can see that there's no difference in any of these categories. This is fantastic research, 145 different fields. So it's not like they made a small effort. This was over 4 years, a huge effort. This is the best paper that I know of, and it's from your backyard, showing how little value that these seed applied insecticides can have, okay? And so they also took the actual pests into account, wireworms and white grubs in particular, and they saw no difference. So this is fantastic work that emphasizes that those insecticides that you really want to coat on your seed because your dealer tells you to, or because the advertisement suggests it's good aren't really having much value. I don't know this, but I'm going to guess that the diamide story is probably similar. I don't know that. I'm happy to admit that. I've never seen those data. Maybe Tracey will do that this summer. The bottom line is, whether you have neonics or diamides, is that you should manage for the pests that you have. If slugs are your biggest concern, insecticides are likely making those slug populations worse by limiting predator populations. And any insecticide can make populations worse. If you're broadcasting a pyrethroid across the field, research has shown that those pyrethroid applications can reduce predator populations. You have fewer predators that can help with your slugs. So it's not just the seed coatings, it's the broadcast applications, it's the seed treatments, it's any insecticide that's being used unnecessarily. From my perspective, what I want folks to do is to scout regularly. Look for those pest populations. I'll take some of the money you might be committing to insecticides, put it into manpower, have those folks scout your fields. If you don't have economic thresholds, you don't need insecticides, then you'll have more predators. Those predators can help with your slug populations. Okay? To provide a little bit of evidence that this works, and then I'll shut up. We've had the Diversified Dairy Cropping Systems project here in Pennsylvania for about this will be the 15th year in the ground. And for all this time, we've been comparing simple rotations and more diverse rotations. The rotations have kind of changed with time. But the key is that from an insect and slug management perspective, we're doing two different things. So in the simple rotation, we're using the kind of the full boat of options. We're using Bt corn. We have corn and soybeans whose seeds are treated with insecticides. We're putting a broadcast where we're using the simplified rotation and we're using the full boat of options, including seed treatments, pyrethroids, and the like. Okay. And that's because of the predators. So this top figure shows the number of slug predators per trap over the first 6 years of the experiment. So that's year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the blue dots, sorry, the blue dots. The gray dots are the high input plots. So that's the low diversity, high insecticide use, Bt corn also. And the black dots are low input. So this is non-Bt corn, no seed treatment, no pyrethroid. And you can see by year 6, our predator populations are much higher. And that has continued on to towards the end of the experiment, which is, this is our last year of doing this. And if you have a good predator population, then you get this same figure I showed you earlier. This figure is from this paper and from these same data sets, where the amount of slug damage on the vertical axis and the amount of predators on the horizontal axis. And if you have a lot of predators, you have much less slug damage. Okay. We've also found in more recent work that cover crops help suppress white grubs in corn. So this figure shows the amount of white grubs on the vertical axis and the amount of total cover biomass on the horizontal axis. So that cover biomass is mostly cover crops, but we also took weeds into account. So the more green material you had in the field, the fewer white grubs you had. So there's this negative relationship. And that's because the amount of cover crop biomass is driving predator populations. Those predator populations are then eating the white grubs. And this is notable because it's a below ground pest. But we still see an effect of predators even on a below ground pest because some predators are able to be active below ground. So the bottom line is that no-till makes conservation possible. Cover crops add to it. Cover crops foster greater natural enemy populations, but they need to be protected with IPM. In an extreme version of this, folks are around Pennsylvania increasingly are planting green. That is, they're establishing their corn or their soybeans into a standing cereal rye cover crop, and that's showing clear benefits for a slug.
John, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you're frozen. Oh.
We lost him, but hopefully he's coming back. While we're waiting, I know some of you probably already have questions, so I'm monitoring the chat. Feel free to type them in, but then of course when John's done speaking, I know some of you are quite confident and able to raise their hand too and unmute, so whatever you're comfortable with. Whitty, I knew you'd be the first. I'm going to message John to see.
We were almost through. Oh, there he is.
Okay.
Ah, he's back.
Awesome.
Good Lord. I guess Penn State didn't pay our bill. I'm not sure what. So, I mean, I'm just about, all I have left is this is my conclusion slide. It's more or less the same slide I already showed. So I'm happy to stop there, take a hint from the gods of technology and answer any questions. I hope I didn't confuse anyone with talking so fast.
No, it was great. I think you just ended right when you're talking about rye cover crop
Yeah.
and that benefit.
Yeah, so we see a clear benefit of that. I'm happy to answer questions about that, but I don't need to go into the details. And I've kind of gone 5 minutes past when I thought I would end anyway. So
I think they're more interested in hearing lots from you. So thanks, John. That was awesome. And we do value your insight into slugs. And I'm actually leave it to Galen to have like a plethora of data to bring forth eventually
yeah.
too. So that's a nice bonus.
Yeah.
We do have one question already from Woody. You may have, I don't know if you've ever been introduced to Woody, but he's quite into cover crops and has been dealing with a significant slug issue. He asked, how far will a slug travel for food?
Well, so slugs are small, but if you're desperate, you'll go a long way. So how far would you travel for food? Right? So I've heard of slugs, traveling like 40 feet in a day to get from one so go across a lane to go to the next field. I don't know much about slugs' ability to perceive the smell of different crops or they don't see very well. They have chemical receptors, but if you're a hungry slug and there's nothing for you here because who knows why, you're going to go. I mean, you're going to spend your last bit of energy till you can find food. So I think they'll go a good distance. And the furthest distance I've heard a farmer describe has been over 40 feet. All right, so I guess I should open the chat thing to see if I can keep up with folks.
It's okay, I'm modern too. The next question is, if you have slugs in a field one year, is that field more at risk in the following years?
Generally, yes, and it makes good sense that would be the case, but it's not as simple as we would like. Folks from Ohio State have asked the question, does slug management in the fall relate to the amount of slugs that are present in the spring? And they found a very weak relationship, even in the same field. That in part has a lot to do with the kind of the winter weather. So you can't predict what your slug population is going to be like in the fall because you don't know what's going to happen in the winter. If it's a super hard winter, then those populations could be knocked back and the population, even though you have a lot of eggs, population just might not materialize. It's also the case that if you don't get the appropriate weather conditions in the spring, then slugs can't be happy. So there are all these kind of abiotic variables that have to come into play. And that's why it's difficult to use fall, say, egg counts or fall abundance of slugs to predict what you might see in the spring. So many things have to go right for slugs to be there and happy. Okay. So, but I guess I think I might have confused the listener there. But generally, it makes sense that if this field has a lot of slugs this year, it should have a lot of slugs next year, but it's going to depend on those abiotic conditions. Sorry.
Good. So we actually have not just Ontario participants, but in general, there's different species of slugs that are existing in fields, but what makes the gray slug more problematic than, for example, in PEI, they have the yellow slug.
Okay. I've been to PI. It's gorgeous country up there. I didn't know they had yellow slugs.
Neither did I.
Uh, in Pennsylvania, we have the dusky slug, and that's kind of orangey, sometimes yellowy. Maybe that's the same thing, but I must say I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Um, so the gray garden slug is, I don't know anything about the yellow slug. I'm happy to admit that. Gray garden slug is a northern European species that was accidentally introduced into the US decades ago. So I don't know if the yellow slug is native or exotic, but if it's a native, it's generally the case that exotics are just a little bit harder because there's fewer predators that kind of know how to eat them. If the yellow slug is anything like our orange slug, they're bigger and fewer predators would eat them anyway. You kind of need birds and whatnot. Like one of the best ways to control slugs is ducks. So I've been encouraging farmers to get into ducks and let those ducks just kind of maraud across your field, but I haven't had any takers yet. And chickens, I guess, don't do as good a job on slugs as ducks. But anyway, there are fewer things that know how to eat an exotic slug compared to a native slug, and that's one of the reasons that gray garden slugs have kind of taken over. Is that and they are very prodigious mucus producers, and the more mucus you can produce, the less things want to eat you. So if you can compare the mucus production of the gray garden slug and the marsh slug are the little black ones that you guys have up there. Marsh slugs and the gray garden slugs are in the same genus. They both have the genus Steraceras. And a slug predator will eat a marsh slug before a gray garden slug most days of the week because of the mucus production. Might be getting a little bit off the track here, but that's what we're
Nope,
doing.
some of these want that kind of information
Okay.
that sometimes I'm like, I don't have an answer for. So,
Okay.
okay, so there's a two-part scenario here. Some are asking, are there certain cover crops that work better, I assume, at reducing slugs or improving predator populations? On that same note, are there some that could instead be used as a trap crop, for example, or a biofumigant to help either drive them to a certain area of the field that you can then use the baits, or act as biofumigant and kind of keep them from or deter them from feeding on the crop? So
Right.
it's those
Those
two
are
parts.
all great questions. I don't have fantastic answers to most of them, but I'll tell you what I know. So, our research has focused solely on cereal rye. I guess my stance is we want to understand cereal rye well and its influence on slugs before we've moved on, and we haven't moved on yet. But I know a lot of folks are keen on cover crop mixtures. A lot of folks are keen on different types of cover crops for different purposes. So, um, brassica, I guess, is good for scavenging nitrogen, and legumes, of course, provide nitrogen. Uh, so I don't know all those details, but I do know from just kind of on-the-job experience that the worst slug populations I've seen usually have a radish associated with them. So my gut tells me strongly that one of the solutions to slug challenges is getting the radishes out of the field, particularly those tillage radishes or the deep-rooted daikon radishes, whatever you want to call them. Those winter kill. I think that's true. And then the slugs are loving them in the fall, and then they winter kill, and that deep hole provides a fantastic place for them to hide. So one option would be to get those out of your mix or use smaller ones that don't feed as many slugs. I have 1 year of good data that shows that crimson clover, for some reason, seems to suppress slug populations. That has been reiterated to me by a number of growers in Pennsylvania and Maryland, but I've tried to get a second year of data with no luck. Whenever I put that experiment out, like the slugs don't come. Um, but my sense is that there are cover crops that can suppress, and there are cover crops that can make worse. And the two things I just mentioned, I'll just reiterate. So I think crimson clover can help suppress, and I think brassicas make slugs worse. I don't know if that suppression is some direct effect of the cover crop on slugs or an indirect effect by prompting better predator populations. I'm happy to admit that. Um, and Tracey, I see Nick Stockman mentioned that he hasn't used seed treatment since Tracey and Jocelyn did their work. And he has slug populations, he still has slug populations in some years. I want to address that particular because my stance on insecticides doesn't explain the whole slug challenge and doesn't explain the whole slug solution. Removing insecticides is just one piece of the puzzle. Nick, you might be lucky to have slugs because of your soil type, how wet things lie, and a variety of other reasons we could kind of imagine not having visited your farms. But predators have to be, in my opinion, part of the solution. And then maybe row cleaners getting the planting date right and all those other things can help. But yeah, as I mentioned when I started, I don't have all the answers, and I don't think insecticides are 100% of the solution or removing them. It's all part of the puzzle that we're trying to figure out. Okay. All right, Tracey, back to you.
Yeah. One comment. Well, some growers are canola growers, and so you can imagine the issues that they may come
Oh,
up
yeah.
with. But slugs might be their secondary pest. Flea beetles are their primary. And one in particular has gone without insecticide seed treatments, but is basically asking, is this a risk? Are they fooling yourselves by doing that strategy? It seemed to help, but is that a longer term risk? Or how do we manage if slugs are actually their secondary pest, but a high value crop that needs the seed treatment?
Sorry, Tracey, I'm just going to jump in. I'll just clarify
Go
because
for
my
it.
question. I'm just
Yeah.
the years before we put in canola, because we absolutely have to have neonics for crop insurance to cover. Like, a lot of this is that we all owe a lot of money, and so our insurance companies won't cover for perils, and we can't get insurance. If we don't have insurance, we don't get bank loans. So a lot of this is like we need the concrete data that you amazing folks are doing to be able to justify not putting insecticides on. But for us, it's the years before we put the canola in, because the canola has to have an insecticide. I'm trying to like front load my predators. Does that kind of make sense? Or
Yeah, it does make sense. And your rotation is what before canola?
so to manage the slugs is kind of silly because I'm an agronomist too. We actually do soybeans before canola, even though they're both sclerotinia hosts, simply because the slugs are a bigger issue than the white mold, because I can spray white mold. So we'll do soybeans so there's as little residue as possible, and then we no-till the canola into that. So the soybeans, the seed dealers hate me because I'm like, I cannot have insecticide on my soybeans. And touch wood, we've been good if we keep the residue down. And then the rest of our rotation is corn with insecticide and wheat with insecticide, and then red clover as a cover crop after the wheat.
Yeah, so yeah, that sounds a tough one. I mean, I get the canola flea beetle thing, and if that you got to prioritize your main pest. But if you can get away from insecticides in those other
Yeah,
steps of the
the less I
rotation,
have, the
the
better it'll be.
better. Yeah,
Okay.
and then you'll be able to, I mean, so the insecticide on your corn is not working for you, and the insecticide, did you say wheat?
Yeah. Well, the wheat, I don't think I can get wheat without Cruiser Max, winter wheat. I don't know if you can get it. I can. It's worth asking.
You can get it in Pennsylvania and smuggle it across the line, but I wouldn't advocate for that.
Well, I'll follow up this with an email to the CNM seeds dealer.
Yeah,
Good
but
idea.
yeah, so we have growers down here, and corn is the same kind of problem down here, because if you want transgenic corn, then it's difficult to get it without insecticide, if not impossible. So what we'll have is growers that will try to expand their rotation so that 1 year of corn doesn't totally ruin what they've accomplished in the other years, say soybeans and part of the year with wheat, where they're not using insecticides to try to bolster that predator population. But there's no doubt you have to go with the control option that works for your main pest. So if you're doing canola and flea beetles are going to take you out, then you have to use the insecticide there. It would just be about skimping elsewhere where you can.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Uh, One question is, do Canada geese feed on, or we call them cobra chickens here sometimes, but can they feed on slugs?
Well, so I've had growers call me about Canada geese taking their corn out of the ground.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. They're more of a
Um,
problem.
so I don't know what Canada geese. My bet is that that's a bit hazardous. What you need are if you look on YouTube, you can find runner ducks that are mobbing stands of crops in South Africa, taking out every snail and slug they can find. I really have made an effort to try to study ducks at Penn State, but I can't find an animal scientist who wants to help me. Because all the ducks down here are meat ducks. I didn't even know that meat ducks was a thing, but
Yeah.
we need other types of ducks.
They use them
They,
in rice production, right? I think I see.
yeah,
Yeah,
we don't
in
have
Asia.
much rice production here in
Nope.
Pennsylvania.
Another question is, are there any other alternative controls like nematodes? And I've not heard of
Ah,
a 2% caffeine solution, but maybe
right.
you
Yeah.
have.
So let me talk about that. Eric asks about practical to inoculate a field with ground
Yeah,
beetles. I'll
that
just
too.
get that one out of the
Yeah.
way first. And that's Eric, I would say that's impractical because you can't buy ground beetles.
No.
If you need lady beetles or you want to buy a praying mantis, you can do that because those can be produced by various companies. But I've never heard of anyone growing ground beetles and selling them. So it's difficult to then, if you can't buy them, you can't inoculate with them.
Hmm.
Eric, if you're going to be an entrepreneur and want to start that, let me know. I would love to get involved with that. It's an option. But alternative solutions. So nematodes are often discussed in part because in Europe you can buy slug killing nematodes and you can run them through a sprayer and distribute them across your field. There's been research by entomologists at Oregon State and University of Delaware that are looking at um, nematode populations. One, trying to figure out where they occur because guy's name is Rory McDonald at Oregon State has found the exact same species nematode that's being sold in Europe, has found it in California, Washington, and perhaps elsewhere. Um, and then the gentleman named Mike Crossley at University of Delaware is looking at how widespread they are and if they're doing anything and if they're here and if they could do anything. I'd say the enthusiasm for slug killing nematodes is fairly high, but it should be moderated a bit because in the UK, where they can be bought and sold, people still have slug problems. It's not like that's the silver bullet that's solving the problem. It can be part of the solution, and if that becomes a commercial product because Rory has found it in various states and because Mike has found that it can be effective, that could happen. But man, that's probably a decade off. So thinking about nematodes for slugs is a long-term solution, a solution that will take a while to come to market. It's not something you can rely on in the short term. Um, the gentleman mentioned, Peter mentioned caffeine solutions.
Yeah.
So Rory at Oregon State is also studying kind of these alternative approaches. Caffeine solutions makes some sense. I've never seen any research on it. Rory is exploring essential oils like orange oil and peppermint oil. I've played with a little bit of orange oil extract. There's a product on the market called Prev AM that is an organically improved insecticide and fungicide and herbicide. It's kind of a weird solution, but it's mainly orange oil. And if you spray a solution of orange oil on slugs, man, they shrivel up in a heartbeat. But that's in a petri dish. But in an experiment that I did on plants with this orange oil, um, the plant seemed to protect the slug somehow. So if they didn't get a full spray, then the slugs go on living, and that stuff it doesn't seem to have much residual activity. So as soon as it's dry, the slugs can go slide right over it and don't get a dose of it. So those types of things, my sense is that they need to be contact poisons. If you have enthusiasm to try that, have at it and tell Tracy or Lorraine how it goes. Tell me how it goes, but I've never seen any data that that stuff works, but that doesn't mean it doesn't. All we need is a curious person to give it a shot and then tell us what they learned.
I have not heard of that one, so that's interesting. Woody's asking, will a spring till pass reduce the slug population by drying out soil in the strip?
Yes, Woody, we have research on that, a spring till pass. And by a till pass, I hope you don't mean anything too aggressive. I've seen it, and in my hands, I've done it with a disc, like a gang of discs set up vertically so they're not moving soil side to side. So like the minimal disking, because at the time we didn't have a turbo till unit on our farm. And that did knock back slug populations by drying out the field faster. What we didn't see in that experiment is any connection to productivity. Yes, the slug population was lower, but no, it didn't benefit yield. But I mean, I guess generally, if we can reduce slug populations, there's a benefit there. But I didn't see anything that came out in terms of productivity.
Can I jump in quick?
Of course. I was surprised you were typing, Woody.
So what I did this year is spring strip till pass. So not the whole field, 10 inches, and then left living cover crops between my rows that have just terminated just before the sunflower crop emerged. So that was my strategy this year. Now I don't think I have slug pressure neither, so I don't know if it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so drying out the soil makes sense biologically, and the turbo till study that I mentioned by John Wallace kind of supports that. But whether that has a long-term effect on yield, we haven't seen that yet. So it's kind of an open question.
And that goes back to my question, well, how far slugs will move if they're happily living under my cover crops and between the rows? Would they crawl across dry
Yes.
ground to get to sunflowers?
Yes, but again, our belief of the value of soil temperature, row cleaners, and pop-up fertilizer is a faster growing plant. It's not that the row cleaners are moving slugs far enough away not to be an issue. It's that they're getting out of the ground. The plants are getting out of the ground faster. So anything that makes the plant grow faster will have a benefit for slug control. Doug mentions hammerhead worms. I've heard that hammerhead worms will eat slugs also, but I also know that hammerhead worms are an exotic that cause all kinds of other problems, including eating native earthworms. That's a contradiction. There are no such things as
Yeah, I
native
was going to
earthworms
say,
anywhere.
what's native?
But they eat earthworms. So Doug, there's kind of a pro and a con there. The more hammerhead worms we have, perhaps the fewer slugs we have, but then we might have fewer earthworms. I'm not sure how to balance those two things, and that genie is already out of the bottle. So I'm not going to encourage anyone to get more hammerhead worms in your field, even if I knew how to do that for you. I run across them here and there. They're kind of a cool looking animal, but man, they are their influence is totally unstudied, I'd say. Nemaslug is available for gardens in Ontario. So that sounds like a nematode for slugs.
Mhm.
If it's available for gardens in Ontario, maybe someone can try that. What are you doing tomorrow,
Cost
Tracey?
effective. Yeah. They tend to be higher price, but
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be
Yeah,
interested in seeing what species they're using.
yeah.
So Nick has mentioned his approach this year. I don't know, Nick, if you want to actually unmute and talk about it. He had crimson clover. Oh, yep, he is. Awesome. Nick?
Yeah, I had crimson clover in my biostrips actually in the fall of 23 after wheat, and it overwintered. And last spring was wet on my clay, and I figured, okay, well, we'll let this stuff grow. It'll pump moisture out. Well, we kept getting more moisture, and it just didn't pump it out. Had a tremendous crop of crimson clover, and bees loved it. It all went to seed too, of course. So I didn't get the corn planted. Seeded sorghum Sudan grass because I wanted to cover crop there. I didn't want to go into beans because it was going to go into beans this year and BNIPs and that and all the, those kinds of things. So I clipped it twice. Then in the fall, because that field is part of the on-farm program, I put in cereal rye in plots. And the field that had the really high level of crimson clover, after 2 weeks, I walked across the field and I didn't see any cereal rye. So I'm looking, digging, and all I'm seeing is carcasses of cereal rye seed and slugs out of the yin-yang. So that kind of alerted me, okay, well, that's field's going into soys this year. I could have a real issue. I either want a hot, dry spring, or I've got to do some tickle tillage. So after listening, and this all occurred, yesterday and the day before, would have been nice to have heard this from John on Friday, but that's okay. So I ran the Turbo 330 over really lightly, but I did leave an untouched strip just so that I know if I made the right decision or not. And actually, that untouched strip planted really nice. Whereas the work ground, yeah, it looks nice, but the moisture content is a little more uneven because it's been worked in that. So I guess I'll know in November whether I made the right decision. That's usually how it is when we farm. Thanks.
Yeah, so I learned something from, I've never heard it called tickle tillage. I love that. That's great. But I didn't, I guess he's just laying out a scenario that he hopes works
Yep.
out well. I didn't hear a question and all that.
That's what these these guys do, right? And they learn. And leaving an untouched strip is the best way to kind of learn. And hopefully, fingers crossed that you do learn something from it. And the slugs, I'm hoping, given the hot, dry weather, we're going to be, well, no, it's going to rain later today, but hot weather might help the plants get up quicker too. So that might help.
Yeah, so Alan just added an interesting point. He said when we're full tillage, we would have terrible slugs after red clover and manure, to the point where we quit the red clover. Alan, I would have thought that maybe you quit the opposite, but maybe you can't because you have manure and you can't quit manure. But we certainly see, and there's good evidence that from our data and others, I believe, that slugs are worse where you manure. That's just part of the deal. You have more organic matter, maybe more moisture on those fields, and that just makes things worse. I've also heard from a gentleman that is a pig farmer that his manure is so hot with nitrogen that he thinks he just scorches his slugs every year. So if he thinks if he waits a little bit later in the spring to put out his manure, that he actually has a slug, kind of a nitrogen solution-esque influence on his slug populations because his hog manure is so nitrogen rich that he's killing slugs by putting out nitrogen solution, by putting out that pig manure, which is a goofy idea because I'm thinking he's going to spread it. It's mostly liquid, so it's not really going to mat down the plants, but I wouldn't want all that manure hitting my plants directly. But I think he was going to try that in the coming years. I just haven't heard back from the guy. Beef feedlot moldboard plow. Yeah. That moldboard should be taking care of your slugs. I am impressed that they were there after the red clover. Alan, was that only on the edge or was that the like deep into the heart of a big field?
Clay knolls.
Oh, on the clay knolls. Okay. I wonder where the slugs were hiding on the clay knolls.
Yeah.
I guess you don't, I mean, those aren't going to be tilled as well, right? Can you explain that to me? Why is that? Tracy's baffled. No
No
clue.
clue. Yeah. So that brings up a point. I didn't see, or maybe I missed it, discussions on shelter sites, to kind of monitor your slugs. Do you have any suggestions on where to focus those or, continue to follow through with? And what kind of numbers are they looking at for when it indicates there's a problem?
Right, so you're talking about scouting generally, right?
Yes, yeah, and shelter, yeah.
Yeah, so our research is all based on shingles. So we use 1 foot by 1 foot white roofing shingles that we cut up. You can buy a roll of them and then you put them out in your field once you cut them up. And we tend not to have farmers that want to do that, but our county-based educators will do that for certain farmers that they're collaborating with. And we tend to put out 10 per field, and if we're consistently finding 1 to 2 slugs across all 10 of those shingles, we have an indication that slug populations are big enough to cause economic damage. And that doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of management unless you're going to be spreading bait soon, or you're going to use the nitrogen solutions. That just means that those fields might need to be watched a little bit more closely to do one of those things, right? That's all that means. It does, because there aren't reactive things you can do beyond the nitrogen solutions or deploying baits. Is there a soil type slug population correlation? That is a fantastic question, Eric, and we are working towards that. At the moment, I am working with colleagues at Delaware, Ohio State, Virginia Tech, University of Maryland, University of Delaware, and Oregon State, and we have a project tracking slugs across all those locations. Maybe not Oregon, he's just part of the puzzle. And we're trying to get a big enough data set where we can ask those questions like, what's the relationship between soil type and slugs? What's the relationship between the slope or the aspect of the soil? And the aspect is just the direction that the soil is kind of pointing. Sorry, the land is pointing. So a south facing, north facing, that type of thing. And the soil type, which I already mentioned. And what's that relationship with slugs? So we're trying to get those data now. But we don't have it. My sense is that there has to be a relationship between soil type and slugs, but my sense is also that that relationship is going to be something that we probably already know. Like the good ground that we're no-tilling is where the slugs are happy, not the sandy ground or the shale knobs or something like that. Yeah, I think we're going to get information that just confirms what we know, but it's not going to be that helpful. But we're going to still get it. Perth. I didn't know there was a Perth in Ontario.
Yep, a county. Yeah, and yeah. We have some similar names.
I've been to Wyoming. Jocelyn took me to Wyoming. Isn't that a town?
Yeah.
Tough clay is always worse. Yeah, the soil that dries out the most slowly kind of tends to be the worst for slugs. There's no doubt about that.
And the question about drones.
Drones.
Given baits are technically a pesticide, Transport Canada likely does not permit that yet. Though we are able to now apply biocontrols with drones like wasps, and we're doing predatory mites. So we're getting there, and something like the baits are at least easier to do because you don't have to worry about water volumes, etc. So I suspect, though, within the current act of Transport Canada for drones, you cannot apply them. But worth asking.
And I've heard of folks doing that in the US.
Yes.
But yeah, I can't speak about. Tracey's already done the job for talking about Canadian regulations. Yep.
Well, we learned the hard way because they did change the act. It said last year you can't apply any living organisms, which then they realized, well, we really just meant like humans and mammals and things. So then they realized, okay, you can do biocontrols, but I know if it's a pesticide, there's a bit more regulations on that. But it's coming. Nothing. Oh, wait. Could calcium chloride? I think that meant desiccate slugs, similar to urea.
Yeah, Peter, that's an interesting question. Everyone has had, I hope, everyone has had the childhood experience of sprinkling some salt on slugs, and it works like a marvel, right? They just kind of melt away. I've never seen that employed on a kind of field-wide basis because I think because there's concern about too much salt. I mean, there's concerns with salinity in fields already. There's parts of various states, the ones I know best are in Maryland, where the fields are getting saltier and saltier, and that has a scientific term, salinization or something.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's not a good thing. But a little bit of salt is probably good for slug control. So I don't know the answer to your question, Peter. Calcium chloride may have an effect. I don't know what that'll do to plants. I don't know what the long-term effects are if that builds up or if the next rainstorm, next bout of rain will just kind of dilute that out. I've also been asked the question, if I'm going to use an herbicide, which I'm going to use, should I use the salt version of the herbicide? Because that might have some slug control benefit. That logic is sound as far as I'm concerned, but I've never seen anyone test it, and I don't know the value of it. But just intuitively, if the slugs are out and they get a little bit of salt, that's probably not a good thing. Whoa, what's that? There's a picture.
Sluggo. He's
That's
ready in
Sluggo.
case.
That's an expensive picture.
It is an expensive picture. I was thinking that. So
Yeah, well, and so I guess on that point, Steve, Tracy, is medaldehyde not approved in Canada?
right.
I see.
It's not
Yeah,
really.
okay. Our so we've had just for a full comment on medaldehyde. Medaldehyde is not a silver bullet because in the United Kingdom they use it abundantly, and now it's restricted. It's getting more and more restricted because of water quality issues. So if you had medaldehyde, your life wouldn't be that much easier because you'd probably have water quality issues. And we're starting to think about that in the United States. Because of that, folks are more interested in, or some folks are more interested in the iron-based baits, which is Sluggo. And I know it's an expensive product, but there are people that are messing around with trying to run the iron-based baits or the medaldehyde-based through their planter at planting. And I have a couple growers that swear by putting 10 pounds to the acre banded over the row at planting, and they say they don't have slug problems. But I don't know if that pencils out. I mean, that seems awfully expensive. Just think of a 100-acre field, and if it's $22 to the acre, right? So that's $22,200 for just the slug control. I question whether there's value there, but the gentlemen that are doing it think they have no choice. So if you take that route with Sluggo, I encourage you to do some math to figure out if it makes economic sense. So my neighbor from northern Germany, is Perth near northern Germany?
No, but
Okay, so this is a real Germany.
we have a diverse population here.
Tells me the belief there is that not just the tillage, but the elimination of lumps and air pockets in soil keeps hackers. Oh,
So you
so
wonder if there's a benefit or if the compaction may have negative effects on soil health, but I'll
yeah,
let
that's
you.
funny. Jeff, I've never heard of a benefit to compaction. I would think that's what he's doing, right? Tough clay makes sense
From
to
what I
me.
understand.
Yeah, that's a new one to me. I've
Mhm.
never heard of eliminating lumps and air pockets because those lumps and air pockets would benefit the plants
Yeah.
also
And beneficials, right? The
and
movement of,
beneficials, right? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So that one seems, I wouldn't say it seems hard to believe. I don't know what the trade-off is there. If you get a slug control benefit, are you negatively influencing your plants by making them grow in a condition that's more challenging for
Mhm.
them? So Jeff, I can't answer that one.
And does slug bait have any influence or impact
Ah,
on beneficials?
depends what you call a beneficial. So the biggest negative influence of slug baits that I've heard in the U.S. are dogs getting into formaldehyde.
Right. Yeah.
Determines
And
if
deer.
you're, other vertebrates. So if those are beneficials, then yes. It's unclear whether medaldehyde or other baits influence earthworms, but perhaps you have used these products, you have seen that earthworms will gather them into their burrow just like they gather residue into their burrow. And you can excavate an earthworm burrow and see bait kind of along the walls. Um, I don't know if those animals end up being exposed to a high enough dose of those materials because they don't seem to be consuming them. I don't know if they have a high enough dose to be problematic. Um, and it's poorly understood how medaldehyde kills slugs, and earthworms might not have the same level of exposure. For the iron-based baits, I would think that enough iron would be toxic to slugs if they ingest it, but if they're just have it on their burrow and they rub past it, I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know. My bet would be, because of all the work in the UK and medaldehyde, my bet would be that if there is a negative influence on earthworms, we would have heard about it by now. But I don't know that one. So that's a blind spot for me. Um,
Maybe the
any
last one.
any
Any
seed
seed treatment?
treatment with iron have any positive effects? That's an interesting question. I don't know if, I guess there's a few things that your question make me think that I don't know. I don't know what the concentration of iron is in the iron-based baits. And I don't know what concentration of iron. So just Steve, I don't know. But I don't know now that you're asked the question. I must look at the label of Sluggo or Ferox or Iron Fist, the things we have down here, um, to see what the concentration of iron is in those baits. And then that would allow me to figure out, or at least guess, whether you could put iron at a high enough rate on a seed for it to make a difference. My instinct is to think that you can't get that much iron into plants to make a difference. And the iron
Stay
on
there.
this, I will stay here, Heather, no problem. Um, I would think that it would not be effective just on the seed. It would have to be taken up by the plant. And my understanding of plant needs in terms of iron is that they just need very little iron to be happy. Like if you ever needed to fertilize your strawberries with iron because you get the stripes on the leaves, the amount of iron solution you have to put out is minuscule. It's like 0.01% iron or something like that, or 1% iron. It's very low.
I know.
So I'd be surprised, I guess. That's a long-winded answer to say, I don't know, Steve. He wants to try. I don't know. Are there seed treatments with iron? I don't know. Steve's going to try it. Steve, if you try, let us know.
There's a few things I have tried. I'm not an expert. I just have experience. Last year, we had lots of snow. I rolled a couple hundred acres in January because we had no frost under the snow, and where I rolled within a week, I had about 8 inches of frost. So it's too early to say whether that worked, but it certainly created a better environment for killing eggs and adults. The other thing is, the key is if you've got a spotty cover crop, slugs are your suspicion. And I found some this spring, and I've did a preemptive strike with slug bait, and that field's fine. But I just spread where I had no cover crop, like cereal rye. Where the cereal rye was good, I couldn't find slugs. Where there was no cereal rye, I had a plethora of slugs underneath residue. And the other thing I did last summer was, after the second replanting, I sprayed iron, and within a day the slugs stopped feeding. You can still see slugs on the plants that you wanted to keep, but they didn't eat. So that's why I'm curious of iron working.
And what sort of iron solution did you spray, Steve?
It was a chelated iron. I'm not sure what the percentage was, but it was only a liter to the acre. I mixed it with 10 gallons of water.
Okay, well, that would align with my understanding that you don't need much, um, but plants don't need much. So that's a neat idea. Um, and so this was this a powder that you added to water, or do you have some liquid
Liquid.
formulation?
I think he was going to say
But
liquid.
the challenge is I had plants that were up a couple inches. So we've got to get from that emergent stage, or from seeding stage, to emerge to make this solution an option.
I see. All right, Tracy, now you have a job of figuring out what iron does for plants and slugs.
Well, I was hoping you would, but as you can see, John, this group of growers and agronomists are really keen on testing new ideas, right? So,
Yeah.
and since we are past 10, I'm sure you have other places to go, but really appreciate your time, John, and giving more information on slugs. I'm sure you're going to be contacted by many of this network for more answers or
That's
questions.
fine. That's fine. I welcome the contacts because I gain from these conversations also. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't have all the answers, but we're trying to get more and more every year. Okay?
Awesome.